Hi, everyone. If I could have your attention, I think we are starting a little late, but we have a great program lined up, followed by a business meeting. So I do want to figure that we might as well get things started. I'm Kwame Harrison. I'm president of IASPM, and thank you. And I will be thanking a lot of people who really have made this a special conference for me, and I hope a special conference for all of you. But let me just do my part here, which is to say that we hadn't had a Guthrie event in a few years, and when I initially talked about this with the executive committee, people were really excited about the possibility of getting all of our past Guthrie Award winners who hadn't been recognized on together in some stage or forum to talk. And when I reached out, I was really thrilled that 4 of the 6 winners over the last 3 years have been here, were willing to come here and are here, including Chris Gibson, who came all the way from Australia. That's a big ask. I mean, everybody making their way here is significant, but I need to say that. So I just want to introduce, and then when we started talking about who could we get to moderate such a panel, the name Maureen Mann came up, and I was a little trepidatious, saying, well, I don't know, will Maureen even say yes? And Maureen very graciously said yes. So I am just going to introduce Maureen and then let Maureen take us from there. But most of you, Maureen is someone who needs no introduction, but nevertheless, I'm just going to say a few words to really let you know who we have leading the panel and why we are so thankful that she was willing to come and work with us on this. So Maureen Mann is a cultural anthropologist whose research focuses on African American music and culture, the construction and performance of race and gender in music, and the relationship between race, class, generation, and culture. She is the author of Right to Rock, The Black Rock Coalition and Cultural Politics of Race, which was published by Duke University Press in 2004. And she's also the author of Black Diamond Queens, African American Women and Rock and Roll, which was published by Duke University Press in 2020. Black Diamond Queens was winner of the American Musicological Association's Otto Kinkeldy Award and the Society of Ethnomusicology's Alan Merriam Prize, also the Marcia Herndon Prize awarded by the Gender and Sexuality section of the Society of Ethnomusicology, and it was one of Pitchfork's and No Depression's best books of 2020. I could say a lot more, but that's a mic drop. Thank you, Maureen.
Thank you so much, Kwame, and thank you also to the team that you have at IASPM for inviting me to moderate this panel. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I haven't been attending IASPM over the last, even before the pandemic year, so it's really nice to be at the meeting. I just want to jump in and start with introductions of the Guthrie Award winners, and then we're going to go right into our conversation. Chris Gibson is a Sydney-based musician and professor of human geography at the University of Wollongong, Australia. His research career spans geography, creativity, music, tourism, and environmental sustainability. His first book was Soundtracks, Popular Music, Identity, and Place, the first of 4 on the geography of music, co-written with John Connell. He has since written books on music festivals, surfboard making, and the album Starfish by Australian band The Church for Bloomsbury's 33 1/3 series. His most recent scholarly book, co-written with Andrew Warren, is The Guitar, Tracing the Grain Back to the Tree, which won the IASPM Woody Guthrie Award in 2023. So you're sitting in alphabetical order, it just happened naturally. Celeste Moore is Associate Professor of History at Hamilton College and a historian of sound, transnational media, and Black internationalism in the 20th century. Her first book, Soundscapes of Liberation, African American Music in Post-War France, received prize recognition from IASPM, and also in 2023 for first book. the Society for French Historical Studies, and the Association for Recorded Sound Collections. She has published articles in American Quarterly, the Journal of African American History, and her research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institut d'études politiques in Paris, and the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia. Elliott Powell is Associate Professor of American Studies and Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota. His work sits at the intersection of race, sexuality, and popular music. He is the author of Sounds from the Other Side, Afro-South Asian Collaborations in Black Popular Music, which received the Woody Guthrie Book Award from IASPM, as well as the American Musicological Society's Philip Brett Book Award. He's currently working at a book entitled Erotic City, which examines the intertwined worlds of music and sex in Minneapolis during the 1980s. And he's the current co-editor of the Journal of Popular Music Studies. And Deborah Wong is an ethnomusicologist, professor of music at the University of California, Riverside, and the chair of ethnic studies for AY for academic year 2023-24. She has written 3 books and served as editor for Nobuko Miyamoto's extraordinary memoir, Not Your Butterfly, My Long Song of Relocation, Race, Love, and Revolution. With Sherry Tucker and Jeremy Wallach, she is series editor for the Wesleyan University Press Music Culture Series. Active in public sector work at the national, state, and local levels, she serves on the boards of the Chinese American Museum, DC, RILM, and Great Leap. Her happiest hours of the week are spent going on air with weekly radio show Gold Mountain for KUCR 88.3 FM in Riverside. And she's also the author of Louder and Faster, Pain, Joy, and the Body Politic in Asian American Taiko, which received the Woody Guthrie Award. So please join me in welcoming the panelists and for congratulating and congratulating them on their Woody Guthrie Awards. So the first thing that we want to do is make a gesture to community and communality, which are obviously the conference themes. And we want to do that by, and this was an idea that we came up with during a planning meeting for the panel. We want to do that by launching things by asking each of our panelists to share a section from another panelist's book that they appreciated and read it and say a little bit about it. And this was a really wonderful idea that Emily Gale came up with, and we thought that would be a nice way to get things rolling. What we want to focus on is writing and community, and so this is how we're going to get things started. We'll talk among the people on stage for until around 5:15, 5:25, something like that, and then we'll open the floor for questions just to give you an idea of how things are going to go. So actually, I wanted to start with Elliott, who has a passage to share from Celeste's text.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to read a passage that's coming from your epilogue. And I'm going to read parts of 198 and 199. I feel like I'm in class. For those who are following along, and I mean, I'll read it and then I'll talk a little bit about it, but you pose a central question that's very central to the book, obviously, is why is African American culture so valued when Black lives are not? The celebration of African American culture is closely linked to sets of contemporary systems of racism and exclusion outside of the United States. In some ways, these links are epistemological, just as racism as a system of knowledge that has changed over time, adapting to newer sets of economic conditions and policies while conveying ideologies regarding hierarchy, superiority, and debasement. So too is celebration of projection of knowledge. While it's immediately threatening, celebration nevertheless relies on social fictions. The presumption of intimacy and access, the implicit assumptions regarding who assesses and evaluates, and the belief that a cultural artifact could represent the breadth and fullness of African American culture. Skipping forward. It's not enough to simply juxtapose really the resounding French silence on race and empire with the unprecedented sets of production and propagation of African American music in France. Instead, we must look at the archives of those twinned oral histories, whose correspondences and connections were preserved in state records, in books, magazines, and radio broadcasts, concert recordings, scrapbooks, albums, and the ephemera of everyday life. There we find not only the technologies and intermediaries and networks that helped to produce African American music in post-war France, but also the cultural logic that facilitated the broad appeal of African American culture while quelling the claims of African and African descended peoples to self-determination and dignity in France and beyond. So I wanted to read that passage in part because obviously it's a central question that I think we are still really grappling with, right? This celebration of African American culture and the sets of dispossessions of Black lives. And what I love and very much appreciate about your kind of approach with this is in really kind of going to the archive, which to not only go to the archive, but also to go to the counter archive, right? Which is to say that you talk about, like, one, the state has these records, right? The state is the one that is both inflicting the violence as well as, so reproducing a celebration, right? And so the sets of logics, the sets of narratives, the sets of signs are very much in the archive. But when you talk about the ephemerality of everyday life, that's a counter archive, right? That is a particular archive that is embodied, that is practiced, that speaks to the ways in which Black folks globally are living through state violence. And so for me, in reading that particular passage, right, the kind of juxtaposition that you're asking about the celebration of African American culture and the kind of denigration of Black life, and then you're inviting us to think about the ways in that another kind of juxtaposition, which is the state archive, the official archive, juxtaposed with the counter archive. And it's through that juxtaposition that we get a better awareness in how we can not only kind of assess and evaluate the kind of situations, but how we as scholars might be able to think through a more expansive and liberatory ideal when it comes to the study of Black music. So I'll stop there, and I'll thank you.
Thank you. I'm just gonna, I'm gonna move on. I have nothing to say, thank you. It was hard to choose a passage from this book, The Guitar, which outlines a dense, unsettled, and global geography of guitar production, hemmed in and enabled by, as the authors write, colonialism, capitalism, and planetary scale environmental change and majesty. The guitar in this account is deeply connected to the spaces in which they are made, their timbers, portals to multiple histories and geographies, I'm quoting here, their grains, clues to circuits of trades and ideas, to trees and forests. But my passage is a short one. I'm gonna read from a chapter about the harvesting of Sitka wood, the most widely used wood in soundboards, which I thought would give a sense of the book's texture and voice, and also the ways that it links the materiality of objects to the broader environmental and capitalist frames in which they move. So I'll just be reading this. We sailed from Vancouver Island contemplating Sitka's profound dilemma. The tree compels thinking in centuries, not decades. Plantations would need to be conceived as sites for patient capital, where profit is realized over a longer time horizon. But in the case of spruce and the guitar industry, it is highly doubtful that time and market prices can ever be commensurate. Meanwhile, much rests on sensitive management of what's left. Turning Sitka's centuries-old trees into beautiful heirloom-worthy guitars seems more responsible than using lower grade pieces to produce budget guitars that are poorly constructed or which may just sit idle and unplayed in the corners of beginners' bedrooms. There is a certain tragedy in cutting 500-year-old trees into slices for budget guitars that won't last. Ed Dix told us of his own struggles with this. While he and other tone wood specialists are prepared to sell quality pieces of centuries-old trees to reputable guitar companies, they are frustrated with how the industry undervalues lower-grade pieces, while aspiring to unrealistic ideals of perfect grain and aesthetic appearance. This is a living organic material, Ed reminds us. We're dealing with something hundreds of years old, and yet people are so picky. This is not a plastic mold that we made, you know. The appreciation for it is not there. Ed felt insulted having to haggle with OEM manufacturers of budget guitars over 20 cents per soundboard. Everywhere else, it's about quality, but for budget manufacturers, it's price. Before you even start talking about the grade of spruce, they are straight on to what's the cost, driving you down as low as possible. Is that fair to the tree? Eric Warner felt similarly about solid spruce entering into the budget guitar production network. It's putting a rare resource onto a guitar that won't last and that will end up in a landfill. They just shouldn't be this cheap.
And do you want me to go there? Yeah, go ahead. Okay, is that working? It is. Thank you. It's quite intense actually hearing your own work back on stage. It takes a moment to kind of adjust. So I was given the task of selecting a passage from Deb's book. And this book has everything in it, I think, that exemplifies what a kind of timeless manuscript is about, actually. From a kind of writing craft point of view, it was quite a challenge just to select which section to read. The book has, as Deb lays out in the introduction, 6 critical themes. And it's obviously around taiko drumming. And those themes are the kind of explosion in popularity of taiko globally, certainly since the 1980s, 1990s. It's linked to the Asian American community and community building amidst a kind of corporate neoliberalized version of multiculturalism. There's a thread around Asian American social justice and the work that taiko does in that context. There's also a lovely theme, and I like this. I had this section chosen around, and then I changed my mind, which it's about music and noise and the kind of slipperiness of categories between music and noise, which is just wonderful stuff. A section on cultural sustainability, about organisation building and about tradition, and then a thread around the cultural politics of emotion. It's around the energy, the joy, and the passion. I think one of the things that's so lovely about this book is that those threads, those 6 threads, don't just map kind of clunkily onto structures of a book. You might think that then in a typical book structure, each one of those becomes a chapter in the book, and that's not what you get in this book. Instead, they're kind of woven through and appear and fade into the background as you're taken on a journey through the book. So anyway, I decided not to actually read a section because it's just felt weird to choose a section where you would end up just foregrounding one of those themes and not all of them. And so instead, I decided that I would read a section from chapter 2, which is called Inventories, the Material Culture of Taiko. And it's a section called, just a lovely section, called What's in My Bag? And it's about Deb's carry bag that's taken to performances and to rehearsals. And I think there's just something around, the kind of the way in which the consequential themes of the book coalesce in a seemingly mundane object, or the objects that are in the bag. I also think it's just a wonderful example of how to write the self into an ethnography of music in this way. So it is about emotion, it's about bodily practice, about the material, and it really, I just think, as you'll be able to tell in a moment, enlivens the text. So let me read it. What's in my bag? Let me show you what's in my taiko bag. The canvas tote I use to carry all my taiko paraphernalia just gave out after over a decade of use. It's red and has the distinctive TCLA logo silk-screened on one side. By the way, this book is available online, open access, free, And I say that not to just market Deb's book on her behalf, but also there's links through to performances and to images and things. And so as I'm reading here, there are actually links here to see the bag. You can see the bag and its contents, which is, I strongly encourage you to do. It's wonderful. Luckily, my mother had bought a bag just like it from my teacher and was kind enough to let me have hers. She didn't play taiko, but was a faithful audience member and supporter. This chapter is not a taiko primer. I know what the early chapters of an ethnography are supposed to do. The genre dictates that the scene should be set, maps provided, and the histories defined. This chapter will not give a tidy overview of, well, anything about taiko. This book will not begin with times past, summaries, or taxonomies. I begin instead with the things closest to me, the things I need to play, and the attitudes towards them that I've learned from my friends and teachers. You will learn what's in my taiko bag. This is an inventory. My bag is always full of what I'll need, plus a lot of detritus from rehearsals and past events. The main thing it contains is my bachi bag, a cloth bag full of drumsticks. Various teachers and local Japanese-American craftspersons make bachi bags, but my mother made mine from cotton cloth with a distinctive Japanese indigo wave pattern. It has a drawstring top and is very simple, but I love it. The material culture of taiko is rich and varied, and taiko players sensuously involve themselves in the material realities of drums, drumsticks, and clothing. They also spend a lot of time thinking and talking about the material things that are part of performance. Drums are, of course, central, but drumsticks are personal, since the drums are often owned by the teacher, whereas bachi are your own. Clothing is both communal and idiosyncratic. Performance costumes are the result of agreement and often identical for the whole group, whereas rehearsal clothing is individual but considered. In short, the artifacts surrounding taiko say a lot about the player's attitudes, beliefs, social aesthetics, poetics, and conflicts. I'd highlight it a lot more because it's just so good, but I'll probably end it there in the interest of brevity.
Wow, thank you, Chris. Thank you, all of you. This is really pretty suspenseful for the authors, right? We didn't tell each other ahead of time, what we were going to choose and read. Yeah. Hey, can I ask, is there a remote audience? Are there folks out there, or maybe I should ask you? Is anybody out there? Nobody out there. You're out here. Yeah, they're out there. Yeah, can I just say, Elliott, I love your book. I love your book. Yeah, how many of you have opened Elliott's book? Okay, all right, very good. I've chosen a passage from the end of chapter 1. Yeah, and this is a chapter that offers close readings of Coltrane's work and life. And the chapter is titled A Desi Love Supreme, John Coltrane, James Baldwin, and the life side of Afro-South Asian music. And Elliott, he's drawing from Coltraneology, right, in very considered and informed ways, but oh gosh, your readings are all your own. Yeah, it's quite something. He's reading, it's so hard to boil this down, but Elliott's reading Coltrane through James Baldwin, through another scholar critic, through. This is what you do, Elliott. You sort of put it all together over and over again. And so I've chosen a passage from the end of chapter 1, pages 38 to 39, where both your writing and your ideas take off, they just take off. So here we go. This chapter has attempted to theorize the kind of love that John Coltrane, as the James Baldwin of horn sound, imagines with a love supreme. For Coltrane, this is a love that informs and is informed by his pursuit of the life side of things. It is a love that sets the groundwork for a Black, queer, utopian musical vision that is personal and political, spiritual and social, Afro-diasporic and South Asian, and thus that challenges previous dominant framings of Coltrane that treat such formations as disparate. It is a love that engenders new possibilities of music making and world making, a love that is never satisfied with the present, but constantly looks forward and beyond the future. It is a love that, much like Munoz's conception of queerness, is always on the horizon. And it's Coltrane's timeless transgression of boundaries that potentially marks his work as queer. So, you know, Elliott, for me, oh gosh, there's so much I like and respect about your book and your work. And, you know, among other things, it's because you keep so many balls in the air, right? And you do it by engaging with other scholars with such informed respect. There's such a care to your citational practice, an ethical care, right? And I feel like the way you read Black studies, through Asian American studies, through queer studies, through diasporic, you keep it all going the whole way through. It's virtuosic. It absolutely is. You know, I mean, to say that you act out, you know, really complicated intersectionality doesn't begin to describe what you actually do. And you do it with sustained commitment. I have so much respect for you, and the book floors me. Your book floors me. So, you know, I've never read anything quite like it. So that's my choice from Elliott's book. Yeah.
So thank you all for those selections. It was our way of bringing the books into the room for everyone hasn't had a chance to take a look at them. And I want to again thank Emily for the great idea of getting us started this way. So we're going to really focus on the writing process, but I want to start with a different kind of question, just a little to continue with the themes that you all are tackling in your texts, because as I was reading through and contemplating your books again, I noted that a common theme of that I want to ask you all to comment on, and it has to do with transnational circulations of people, of ideas, of goods, of musical practices, and of music. And you, as you're tracing these patterns, you're also exploring the communities and connections that these circulations grow out of and that they create. So I'm wondering if each of you could talk a little bit about what drew you to focus on these circulations, and how that focus shaped your research and your writing. And Celeste, I'm going to put you in the hot seat first.
I realized in writing this book early on that, or actually maybe I've realized more as I've moved away from it, that what I've long been interested in is why people are drawn to things that are not, you know, strictly speaking their own, and what facilitates that and what happens in those encounters. And I think there's like a kind of, it's like a good big question, but it turns out I'm not really a historian or scholar who works at that level of abstraction. And I'm really interested, as Elliott noted, in archives. I'm really interested in materiality. I'm interested in kind of what precisely brings a person into contact with an artifact or a thing or a music, and in what ways they, you know, what that sounds like and looks like in every detail. And what became clear was that was a transnational story, and that any illusion I had, or that my historical subjects had, that they were encountering a sort of like empty vessel for kind of a representation of what African American music was in a certain moment, was just kind of being beamed into their lives, right? That was what I was tracing and uncovering. You know, I think the record industry has some parallels, obviously, to kind of thinking about the guitar, that there's just so many layers of people kind of shaping that object and that encounter. So I guess the transnational for me kind of started as an abstraction of like, what does it mean to bring people into contact with something that's so distinct, but then became a kind of archival mania. It became a kind of space to kind of really kind of go into individual people's kind of personal papers, I mean, with permission, and different archival collections and state records, and trying to reconstruct these, you know, these logics. I think the other thing I'll just say is that the everyday for me is something I think about a lot, is like every day on a global scale is really complicated. Like it's like how we experience as individuals and what we listen to or eat or think about, like as tied to these big kind of transformations, is very hard to kind of grapple with, but it's interesting to me. Yeah.
Ooh, okay. I'm still just, just, thank you so much. I'm like, I need to breathe. Yeah, the question of transnationalism, and I guess I'll make this in full disclosure that, you know, Maureen was on my dissertation committee. So, yes. And you know, I think the one of the major differences between the dissertation and the book, I know that's not the question, but I think it's helping me to get to the answer to that, is I think I was doing way too much in the dissertation. I was trying to tackle everything possible that I could do. And what helped me in thinking about sort of the revisions from the book is that part of the reason why I was doing everything is because I was thinking about transnationalism, I'm not gonna say in the wrong way, but in the way that did not do justice to what I actually wanted to do. That I was trying to like, okay, now I have to talk about India, now I have to talk about this place, and I have to talk about the UK, and I have to, like, that's how I felt that I needed to kind of talk about these things, rather than understanding that my project, which the sets of musics are coming out of the US, but the sets of collaborations, the sets of meetings are diasporic. I did not know that when I was working on the dissertation. And I realized that through the book is that obviously through the transatlantic slave trade that brought Black folks here, but thinking also about not only the 1965 sort of Immigration Act that brought sets of South Asian folks here, but thinking even further back and thinking about notions around the coolie trade and within the Caribbean is another kind of transnational form of migration that also informs the sets of artists who I talk about. And it was thinking about that broader history to actually go to so Celeste's question about the archive and about history. That's the thing that I was noticing is like, I'm thinking about these sets of meetings that yes are occurring in the US, but are occurring through diasporic peoples. And that is actually the transnational move that I'm thinking about within the book. That I think in the dissertation, I had no sense that what was happening. I thought I had to do a different form of transnational analysis. And it took the book for me to understand that the analysis that I was already doing was transnational, but I wasn't understanding it as such. And so, yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what I would say about our book, and I want to acknowledge Andrew here, my co-author. Actually, a lot of the words you read out were Andrew's, not mine. So he will love that.
That's the hazard of this surprise choice.
That book started somewhere and ended up somewhere very different. And so when we began this project, we'd written a book about surfboard making, and in that we were introduced to some of the kind of critical issues around certain tree species, particularly in Hawaii, where forests have been kind of like tragically lost. We started to ask questions then around the environmental imprint, the kind of ecological tragedies involved in guitar making. And we began by doing a kind of pretty dry geography analysis of like timbers and where they come from and statistics on imports and exports of different forms of timber. And anyway, we wrote a paper about it, an academic journal article, super dry. And we kind of thought that was it, really. That was kind of like, it was showing that the industry's got this dark side, right? But we didn't make much more of it than that. And Andrew turned to me one day and said, maybe we could do more than this. Maybe we actually need to follow the wood ourselves, kind of materially, viscerally. And the book comes together in a way that makes it look like we always knew all along what we were going to do, but we didn't really. And really, actually, what we did is just kind of followed our nose. So we went to factories and asked where the wood was from, and the people in the factories, sometimes reluctantly, gave us information about where to find their suppliers. We would visit sawmills and so forth. And it was more, a bit, maybe in parallel to what Elliott's saying, a process that unfurled. The more that we traveled, the more that we actually literally followed the material itself, the more we realized it was this entangled transnational story of transnational circulation. So the guitar is itself this kind of cosmopolitan object, but fraught object with the signatures of slavery, of international capitalist trade in endangered species. It's in the instrument. And the more we traveled, the more we realized that's the case. And so the kind of big picture processes, affecting us all are kind of captured in the guitar. And so we ended up traveling far further than we thought we would, and into really unknown and unexpected places. But the flip side of that is exactly what I think Celeste was talking about, that the more we encountered the people involved in making guitars, accessing the timber, forest custodians, First Nations peoples who have rights over those forests, the more we realize that there's also this story of the kind of compromises and contradictions that the people involved in guitar making find themselves with and working through every day in their everyday working lives. So we tried to kind of write the book in a way that told the bigger picture story of the guitar and its entanglement in these transnational circulations, but also try to provide you some sense of the feeling of that, the actual characters involved and how they feel about the kind of circumstances that they have found themselves and their industry in. And so from a book writing point of view, we were trying to do that kind of zoom in and zoom out thing, I guess, in the book.
Wow, that's a really productive question you've asked, Maureen. Let me tell you about someone who is not in my book, but someone who I respect and have been following quite a bit. Because, Japanese Americans are haunted by questions of citizenship, both literal US citizenship and cultural citizenship. And so one of the questions in Asian American studies, has been that, the eternal foreigner versus deportation versus detention. My friend Stan Shikuma is a Sansei taiko master in Seattle, Washington. And he's been involved for the last few years in very focused efforts to protest the Northwest Detention Center outside Tacoma, Washington. If you look that up, and if you look up, protest demonstrations outside the detention center, you'll find photos of Stan Shikuma all over the place, sometimes with his taiko drum, sometimes playing, sometimes simply standing outside in the rain with other activists. Most recently, he went on hunger strike with several other people outside the Northwest Detention Center. So these matters of the transnational are something that for Asian Americans, is deep and immediate. And it's also built into the structure of Asian American studies, where it starts in the 60s and the 70s with, efforts of first having to claim sort of through a cultural nationalist frame to talk about, Asian American pan-ethnicity. But then around 2000, moving towards models that were more focused on the transnational and continued trans-Pacific movements really between. And, for me, looking at taiko, there all those tensions are right there because it's about the ways that taiko both has to defy the automatic inclination of many audiences to read the form as Japanese rather than Japanese American or Asian American, versus the ways in which Stan Shikuma, among many others, has really pushed back, against all the things that create the Japanese American to begin with, So for me, I go from the transnational to the trans-Pacific, really, which is kind of the way in which Asian American studies at this point, right, is really stretching and developing, in really exciting ways. So thank you for the question.
Okay, and thank you for your responses. So I want to shift to focus more on writing practice and process. And again, keeping the theme of community in mind, I want to ask if each of you could talk about the community or communities you envision yourselves writing for. And if you're thinking about people in a particular discipline or across disciplines, people in the academy, outside of the academy, and also what happens if those communities don't line up so neatly. So just some thoughts about writing and who is your imagined audience? Does someone want to volunteer, or should I pick someone? I don't know at this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind. I'm happy to dob myself in. It's a fantastic question and a really good question because in our book, in our instance, we certainly had a particular community in mind of guitar players. So immediately we had these questions around how much to dial up or dial back our theorization, the extent to which we heavily kind of load the text with footnotes. And at the same time, we wanted to keep the guitar playing reader engaged, and we don't want it to not read the book, right? So that was quite a challenge, but a really good one, and one we were keen to embrace. The process I remember writing this book, and it's a bit cheesy, but I thought of it being a little bit like imagining a guitar amplifier, loads of knobs on the front, volume, treble, bass, reverb. You dial things up, you dial things back. And in earlier drafts of the book, we had certain things dialed way more up and then had to dial things back as we edited it and so forth. And it was about getting people to read it from different backgrounds. So I had guitar playing friends read the book. I had scholars, geographers, anthropologists, musicians, music studies people. I also had woodworkers and then people in the industry themselves. So the actual forest workers, some of those read the book as well, and people from the guitar companies. And it's an interesting question because at the end, the geographers who read the book were like, why is all these technical details about the guitar? Who cares? Like, just tell us what this tells us about. What are you saying about capitalism and colonialism? That's what we really care about. The guitar players and the woodworkers who read the book are like, you need way more detail about the wood. We need so much, like there's nowhere near enough here on the dovetail joint on the neck. We need loads of information about that. Get us down to the cellular level of what's happening in these woods. That's what we want to know. And so it became this kind of compromise, actually, of reading through the comments we had from those different representatives, different people from those backgrounds, and just dialing things up and back. Maybe just trying to find a middle ground, kind of equally dissatisfying everybody became the kind of ultimate task. So yeah, I like to think of it as a book where the theory, our politics are pretty upfront in the book, I think, but the theory behind how we're approaching the subject it sits either in the end notes or it's in here, but it's not actually in the text, to try and keep it reasonably engaging for an audience, but not dumbing down that audience. There's Ian Ang, the kind of Australian cultural theorist, she had this lovely turn of phrase that a good scholar should be able to grasp complexity but explain it simply. And that's what we try to do with the book, at least, is to do both of those things. Whether we succeeded or not, I don't know.
My book is based on my dissertation, and I would say that my dissertation at its core is guided by African American history and African American studies, and I think all of the archival points that Elliott was kind of bringing forth, I owe so much to that field. But it was, so that kind of shaped the project, but it was in France. And at the moment when I was writing, a lot has changed in the field of French history, but at the moment I was first writing, talking about race in this particular way wasn't legible for most French historians. Even those based in the US, there was the kind of, and of course when I was actually talking about my work in France when I first visited, people would like recoil from me when I would talk about kind of race and how race and the process of racialization were key. And so that didn't feel like a very clear audience at first, or a willing audience. What changed was, in a way, following out of African American studies and diasporic studies to Black French readers and audiences, which was, I think, the first glimpse I had of how I was going to write a book that was not just about white French consumers of Black music, but it was actually going to open up a whole other door in the book. And so that research, both in France, but also in Senegal, was really transformative in thinking about how people, take these musics and make something new out of it for themselves and their communities. And then I think the other thing I would just say is, as I was revising the book, that was really my first encounter with sound studies and with thinking. I was engaged in jazz studies, though I was moving beyond that genre. And the sound studies offered, in that transition, it was like I got to step outside of my disciplinary training in a different way, and new questions and new strategies emerged. And I think, maybe similar to Chris, I feel like there's ways in which, because I was just at the cusp of that, I'm sure I've disappointed people in those fields, because I was in the process of learning, and I'm still kind of grappling with a lot of that work and loving it. But so there's it's such a long project, for a dissertation. To Elliott will be next, maybe on this. You are familiar. It just goes through so many shifts of audience, as well from dissertation advisors, even wonderful ones, to other readers, right? That there's different kinds of pressures and possibilities. So.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, that's obviously the main kind of sort of difference, right, between the dissertation and the book is that you're not writing for those 4 or 5 people on your committee, right? It's now a much larger audience, a much broader audience, and when it came to my book, I mean, I was scared because I knew that I wanted to write a book that was in conversation with so many different fields, right? With Black studies, with Asian American studies, with popular music studies, with queer studies, and I was so afraid that I should have just been like, some people are gonna be disappointed. I should have thought about that. Too late now, it's already out. But I was like, okay, I have to kind of think about what are the ways in which I can write a book that can speak to those folks in those disciplines, in those fields, who are also looking at ways to, I think, further broaden and expand those sets of fields, right? So that became one of my key goals there. Is like, how can I bring more folks in Black studies into thinking about Asian American studies, right? What are the ways in which I can get those in like Afro-Asian studies to think more about queer studies? Because Afro-Asian studies is such a it's such a field that is centered a lot on race and class to the detriment of gender and sexuality. So that became the kind of goal, is like, how can I, through this book, advance some sort of conversation within these multiple fields? And then, so that's the kind of scholarly audience. And then, when I was working on the second chapter of the book, which is about Miles Davis and On the Corner, I had been wanting to, both during the dissertation, didn't happen, and when I first started working on the revisions, to talk to a guy named Corky McCoy, who was a close friend of Miles Davis, did the album art for a number of Miles's albums in the 1970s, especially On the Corner, which is the one that I talk about in that chapter. And Corky is a recluse. And I tried multiple times to get in touch with him. And then I finally was able to get a hold of his daughter. And his daughter called me, and she wanted to have a conversation about what are the intentions of the book when it comes to her father and Miles Davis. And I explained to her what the book was about, how I'm gonna kind of approach it. And she told me that she would set up a meeting. And so I went to LA, and I had no idea what was gonna happen, but I went to LA, and I met his daughter, I met him, I met his wife. We all went to some sort of office room, and we just talked for hours, just talked. And I remember that in part because after that conversation, we had to have talked for close to 2 hours. I was like, this is more, this is another kind of audience, right? This is someone who I'm also really going to be accountable to. And that was also kind of on my mind is, and without going into kind of certain kinds of details around this, but he's a recluse for a number of reasons, but some of it has to do about how he had shared his story with really sort of other kinds of authors, writers, filmmakers, and had been burned by that. And so I was really keen on making sure that I didn't really recommit those kinds of acts. And I realized that doing this book, there were other people outside of the academy, right, who this book is going to touch and this book is going to affect, and I need to think about that. And so I was, my book came out in 2020, right, smack dab in the middle of COVID, fantastic. But like being able to send my book to Corky and to get confirmation that he had read it meant the world to me. And to kind of get that confirmation again from Corky, from his daughter Blair, from his wife Sandra, that I was getting to the Miles who they knew, right, was really important to me. And so that's when I think about audience, I think about that. There's some other similar kinds of interactions as well involving doing these kinds of conversations and interviews and oral histories with folks that give a particular kind of weight in the work that we do. But I had not anticipated when I first started that. But when I met with Corky and Blair and Sandra, that gave me a particular kind of personal and very much intimate kind of connection and very much accountability. Yeah.
Wow. So I mean, what I'm learning is that really all four of us, we're writing very intentionally and consciously, way beyond academic audiences, right? I mean, and any jazz scholar knows they're going to be read by jazz aficionados, right? And with the guitar work, oh my gosh, right? So it's the same with the taiko. I mean, I was writing for the North American taiko community essentially because I knew they would read it. That's why the book is open access. I mean, I had a responsibility to make the book readily available, and not for $29.95, right? So yeah. The thing about, I mean, I was writing for multiple audiences nonetheless, because whatever you want to call the North American taiko community, it is in fact many different kinds of people. And, it's almost like for me, concentric circles, because the Japanese American community, which still makes up, for me personally, the core of the taiko community, they are very focused on sort of self-ethnography, auto-documentation. They're nuts for oral history. This is all a result of the World War II incarceration, right? So I mean, they are looking after their own history. So I mean, I knew from the beginning that I had to write with and for them, so that was the kind of core audience for me. Beyond that, it was about sort of writing to the Asian American taiko players in terms of offering critical tools for how to think about the work that taiko does and can do if we want it to. And then the outer circle, really, but one which is growing like by the minute and by the day is, because there are more taiko groups all the time. This is a forum that is like completely dynamic and not in any danger of disappearing. Oh no, it is like there are, it's exploded, as a popular forum. It's like the new djembe or something. It's like, taiko. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a growing number of white taiko players, and I'm super conscious of that. And so I was writing towards them in terms of, a little bit of self-check. If you're going to participate in this forum, you need to think about how and why and for whom and all of that. So there were multiple people I was writing for, and I was super conscious of them. It's right there in my introduction. I say, I feel them reading over my shoulder, so it was intentional on my part.
So I'm gonna take the moderator's prerogative to ask one more sort of brief question, and then we're gonna open the floor. So I hope that you all have questions for our wonderful panelists. And I ask this question as a fellow writer who loves to get tips about writing or about the writing process. So I'm wondering if each of you, if you could share a technique or a trick, a writing technique or a writing trick that you use, something that's been helpful to you, maybe especially if you're having trouble making yourself sit back down at the computer, or anything that keeps you going as a writer. So you can enter that question from any direction, but I would just love to hear from you about that. And I'm gonna just let whoever wants to speak, I'm not gonna point to someone on that one.
I guess I'll go first again. I feel terrible going first all the time. I do like to think of like writers having a toolbox of tricks. Definitely, that's the case. There's something about book writing that differentiates it from, I think, most dissertations and certainly from journal articles. There's a lot of latitude with what you can do structurally within a book to keep it lively. And so section breaks, the three asterisks, ellipses, whatever they are. I don't even know if there's a term for that. What are the... Anyway, we use that carefully in certain sections to really bring things to a pause, to change scene, to zoom in and zoom out. So for me, section breaks, thinking structurally along those lines is something that you can really play with. And in the background to that book were, like printed versions of early drafts where we would chop things up with scissors. We would physically move things around on a massive desk we could find in the building we're in at the university and splay things out and then move things around to see where little sections might fit best. So print things out, think structurally, be creative with structure, and the book itself as a kind of format allows you to do that. So be creative with that, your structure.
That's great, thank you.
I think my strategy as a graduate student was to schedule regular sort of possibilities of public humiliation. So that was it was kind of like every few months, a workshop, and it's interesting to think about, right, that system of accountability at other points can get replaced by other systems of accountability. So I think writing I actually one time, this was probably not advised, shared work with a woman whose husband had passed, but I was writing about his life, and that's a very challenging thing to do, but it really strengthened what I was writing. So I think finding systems of accountability, be it sort of, again, that kind of public display or but also other kinds of more ethical responsibility. And then my very tiny idea or suggestion is sometimes I don't finish a sentence in the hopes that finishing that sentence a day or two or a week later will bring me back into the headspace. It's risky. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you've lost it entirely, but sometimes it helps you rediscover that writerly voice. Yeah.
Yeah. I have two thoughts that came to mind. One is, so I always make this remark, I can't work in cafes. I can't, in part because one of the ways in which I write is that I have to walk around and either talk to myself or talk to my phone about what I'm going to say. So I need that, and I have to be moving. I can't sit. I have to be. So it's a thing that in order for it to get me to write, I need to think about what I'm going to say, and that requires me to stand up and walk around. And then I'm either talking to myself and kind of remembering sentences. I would kind of repeat the same sentence over and over again to make sure that it sounds the way that I want it to sound. And then I will record it on my phone, or I'll take quick notes and do that kind of stuff. So that's the one thing. The second thing is, it is about writing and it's not about writing. It is making your body, and I'm getting this from my dissertation advisor, Jack Chen, is to get your body ready to be, to engage in something that doesn't have any rules in terms of writing, that doesn't actually have a recipe. So this is how I will kind of explain things. Is that I had I had a meet. This was when I was in grad school. I had a meeting with Jack about. I was frustrated with writing some chapter, and he was like, we don't actually know each other. So let's kind of get together and just kind of chill out and talk. And he asked me what I had done the previous day, and I was like, oh God, I'm gonna volunteer myself. I'm not gonna do this if anyone asks me. I had baked a cheesecake, which I sometimes do. And so I baked cheesecake and I'd done this thing and it was really good. It was guava. Anyway, it was good. So Jack was like, wait, this makes sense. And I was like, what do you mean this makes sense? And he was like, the way in which you're writing, the way in which you're approaching this dissertation, the way in which you're kind of thinking about things, there's an order. There's a way that you want to structure things specifically. He's like, you can't do that for a dissertation. You can't do that for a book. You have to throw those things you have to throw those things away. He was like, so what I want you to do is I want you to start cooking, no recipe, entering that. And he was like, you need to get comfortable with that. Get comfortable with not knowing what is going to happen next. Get comfortable with not knowing what it's going to look like, if it's going to turn out good or not. You need to get comfortable with that. And that's another thing about the writing process that has stuck with me. So when I am stuck in writing, I will actually just go into the kitchen and I'll just make some random thing like I'm on an episode of Chopped and hope that it turns out well. But that's what I end up doing. And it trains my body to get back into that position. Because often I'll get stuck and I'll just say, Jack said, go into the kitchen. So that sounds weird, but to kind of do that kind of work is a way for me to let loose and do that. So, yeah.
Thank you for permission to go into the kitchen while we're writing. It's great.
Oh my God, so you walk and talk.
Yeah.
Do you read your own work out loud as you, yeah?
Yeah, I was going to say, reading out loud is another good one, I think.
Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, Andrew and I we might have been in a sawmill or a factory or somewhere, and we would hop into the car, find the nearest McDonald's car park, sit in the car and talk to each other and record on the phone, and then transcribe that, and that fleshed out to become sections. And so really similar, like different but similar kind of process. And and like you don't put any rules around it. It's just you're just having the conversation.
Oh, wow. Oh, cool. Okay, now I want to do that. But I like writing. I have my own little, tricks. I don't do, substances, but my best writing is like, in the morning, haven't yet eaten, have had enough coffee to be, zing, and then stuff starts to happen, but I do like writing. I mean, I enjoy it, and the kind of writing I want to do, I know what kind I want to do. I don't always succeed, but I want it to be like all the time, every sentence, both theorized and grounded at the same time. That's what I want. Sometimes I get there, okay? It's not all the time, however. But it tends to happen with that morning writing, and later when I read it back, usually out loud, if it doesn't move me, it doesn't stay. Yeah, so yeah, I don't know if that's a trick, but that's what works for me.
Thank you all. So I think we can go to questions. Do you have a mic for the, okay, so. I think maybe just raise your hand or you'll go to them. Yeah. Oh, there's Steve. Hey, Steve.
Hi, everyone. Great panel, great discussion, loving it. Great having you all up here at once. I have a question. I hope it comes out right, but I'm thinking about how different you all are methodologically and disciplinarily. Geographer, historian, American studies, ethnomusicologist. You've all won the book award for this organization. And I have said for years in different contexts that I think one of the things that's really important about this organization is it really is about popular music studies as an interdisciplinary field. But I'm curious to hear you all comment, or any of you who want to, comment on how much popular music studies as such is something that you think about when you think about your practice, as opposed to whatever your home discipline is. And to what extent that's something that, like when you got an award from this organization, was that like oh yeah, that's my thing? Or were you like, oh, okay, cool. I don't really think of, you know, one way to put it, right?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I was floored when I got, the Guthrie Prize, in large part because this is, I mean, it's gonna sound however it's gonna sound. It's gonna, it can be a soundbite, but like, I feel when I first came to IASPM, I realized that this is a place that I wanted to continue to go to, because I felt as if the kinds of ways that I was thinking about popular music were landing, were resonating with folks in a way that I didn't feel that way, sorry to say, ASA. As much as I love ASA, it did not feel the same. I felt like the kinds of things that I was thinking about in terms of how I was doing work in music, folks in ASA were just like, oh, that sounds nice. And they would just kind of keep it moving. And I don't remember the year, but whenever I came, the first time I came, oh no, I do remember, it was UCLA. No, sorry, it wasn't UCLA. Cheryl Keys was president. It was in San Diego. I remember that was the first one that I went to, because in the hotel, the lights went out. If anyone was ever we lost power at that, that's why I remember that. But anyway, that was the first one that I went to, and I remember thinking, yeah, this is where I want to go. This is the kind of community, this is the kind of sort of reception, this is the kind of thing that I actually want to be a part of. And so, when I was presenting earlier today on some new stuff that I have no idea how it's going to fit, if it's going to be a one-off thing, I was like, I know I can take this to IASPM, right? And I had a conversation with Shauna Redmond on Thursday about that same thing. And Shauna was like, yeah, no, like really IASPM is the place to do this newer work, to actually get the particular kind of feedback that's necessary. And so for me, to answer your question, Steve, 100%, for me in popular music studies, I do think quite often about it. And I see the way in which I think about my own work as being directly influenced by being here, participating here.
I had first heard about the organization and award, I think it was in Carl Hagstrom Miller's book, Segregating Sounds, and I had thought about that book was like something that made sense to me, right? It's very material, and also thinking about racial kind of ideas. And so I'd always kind of had it like lodged in my head as like the, I don't know, like that was the pinnacle, right? Of like, that was the prize in the organization that would understand me. It's funny because I didn't go to the organization, or I wasn't involved because I was feeling very obligated to all these different fields, jazz studies being one of them. And then when I started to break out of that genre of, hit French history and then so it wasn't my intellectual home, but it's funny, just as your question, I was thinking, it's like I had already picked it as like that would be the organization. It sounds so obnoxious, but I had seen it as this thing that would recognize the fullness of what I did. I don't know. And so I guess that's how I felt. It was like really, really meaningful. I hope that even though I feel like my own conference attendance and kind of participation is far too expansive and not deep enough. I was just complaining about this to a colleague over lunch, that it's hard to feel like you're doing all the necessary work for all the places you care about. But yeah, that's what I experienced.
Steve, I appreciate the provocation. I'll say just frankly that for a long time I didn't see me or my work or my priorities as being within popular music studies, primarily because for a long time, in the 80s and 90s when I started to pay attention as a young scholar, it struck me that the popular music studies in the US and North America was really very much, had this core rockism, formation that I didn't see myself in, and didn't see space for myself in, so watching popular music studies stretch and become ever so much more than that, and put that to the side as its own tradition, but to, expand what the field could be. That's what drew me in the end. And at this point, I do care. I care very much about popular music studies, and I want to be part of that, those changes, those developments, those futures. Yeah. Chris?
Yeah, look, back in the 1990s, which is showing you how old I am, did my PhD in a geography department on popular music. And there were people in the department at that time that just thought that I was weird, and what I was doing was weird for a geography department, because geography is about land and it's about, you know, the environment. And the very first academic conference I ever went to was at IASPM Australia, New Zealand. And instantaneously felt more at home there than I did at geography conferences. So it was very much part of my early training, I guess, the world of popular music studies. And then what became my first book with John, Soundtracks, that work had been presented at different IASPM conferences, and it was really popular music studies that we read as much as or more than geography, actually. And so, so it's always been, I think, a community with which I have a really strong emotional connection. I would say that and maybe there are parallels, Celeste, maybe perhaps, that, I don't know, but my day job is as a geographer in a geography department where I don't get to teach anything to do with music. I have a sustainability unit that I teach. There's like a fragment of one lecture I can talk about the guitars and the guitar book. And so I have that day job responsibility to geography. The only conferences I get funding to go to are geography conferences. So, but wherever possible, I will self-fund to attend IASPM conferences and do that as often as I can, at least in Australia. This is the first US IASPM that I've been to. But, and so, yeah, for me, it's like the emotional kind of community that I always come back to because it's where I began. And when we wrote this book, and the publisher always wants you to nominate for loads of awards, and I'm not really into doing that. The only award that we wanted to go for was the Woody Guthrie Award. It was the only one that really made sense to me for the book that we'd written. So I hope that, yeah, Steve answers your question, but it's, yeah. Playing in different fields is a challenge professionally and financially. We try and manage that as best we can personally.
Thank you all.
As long as we're demystifying the process, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about publishing. And Chris, you mentioned, you know, the relationship you had with your publisher. I was wondering if you could talk about how you either wound up publishing with the publisher that you did publish with, or if you had any words for people who are looking forward to publishing books and things they might want to bear in mind.
I'm happy to start. I published with Duke, and it was in the Refiguring American Music series, which was edited by Nina Eidsheim, Josh Kuhn, and Ron Rodano. And it really came down to Ron Rodano. I met him at at a rhythm changes conference, a jazz conference in Amsterdam. It's an interesting scene. I'll just leave it there. But I gave a presentation, and I feel like if I was going to kind of paraphrase Ron Rodano, it was my first. It was maybe I just finished research. It was really quite early in the writing process, and I gave his paper, and then I think he had his sort of like "come back and see me, kid," kind of like. I mean, it was less condescending. It was not condescending. It was lovely. It was like, you know, come talk to me when you write this book, and I did. I kind of emailed him as soon as the dissertation was done, and I said. It's here, you know, and so I would say my experience with the press and with him and the series and with Kim Wissaker, who's the editor there, was just it was just I think a generous and generative process of people bringing in readers, and just I mean it couldn't have been more generative and challenging, but really really wonderful. So that was how I came to my press.
When I was, looking for a publisher for this book in 2017, 2018-ish, I was so focused on the open access possibility that I went straight to University of California Press because they had the Luminos series. You know, they were fairly early out the gate with open access possibilities, which always means that somebody still has to pick up the tab. And I also knew that, my dean would probably be willing to put forward the $7,000 that somebody had to, put forward. So there are very pragmatic concerns. But I'll say at the other end, the matter of publishing monographs has really changed a lot in the last 20 years, like a lot, right? And at this point, I've never done an advance contract, but, if I get it together for a fourth book, I absolutely, for the first time, want to do an advance contract, because I've now seen, like, getting feedback at that point in a book project is just like a gift and a half. You might need to wait 6 to 12 months to get that feedback, but if you have the luxury of time, it's really extraordinary to get it. So I've seen it happen for other people. I now want it. I'm not going to do what I did with my other books, which was to say, here it is, the whole thing. I want to take a little bit more time with it. Yeah, and get that initial round of suggestions. Yeah, publishing has changed a lot. What about any of you?
Yeah, so I publish with the University of Minnesota Press. I am at the University of Minnesota. Essentially the editor there, Danny, that was the first meeting that I ever had to talk about what would later become the book. And it was a fantastic meeting. And I remember Danny was just so nice and understood it and was really curious about these things. And I was explaining how I was envisioning the book. And I remember, and she was right, because it's true, she was like, there's a chapter here that's missing. And I was like, yes, it's true. I knew, but I was hoping that she didn't know. But she noticed. She was like, something's not adding up. What you're saying is the book going to do, this makes sense up until there's a hole here that and I was like, yes, no, I know. But she was like, but that's not a big deal. Because I had just started at Minnesota. It was in my first year. She was like, you have lots of time. And she just kept checking on me. To see how I was doing, to see how the research is going, to see how this is before, she was just, and I was like, oh, this is really incredible. But I was still, I had something where I thought, oh, but I should probably maybe talk to other presses. And so I did, which I think that everyone should. And nothing compared to my multiple meetings with Danny. I met with other editors. Some of them were good. Some of them were terrible meetings. Some of them that was on me. Some of them was on the editor. And so I remember thinking, oh, I need to really get in this thing in the gear. And so I was thinking about all the meetings, and I was just like, I have to go with Minnesota, because Danny understood the project, was really sort of overwhelmingly supportive of it, saw things that I did not see about the book, and was committed to seeing it through. And I'll expand a little bit on that last part. Danny ended up leaving the press and leaving academic publishing while I think my book was about to go into copy edits, maybe something like that. And I was like, oh no, right? I remember having this fear. And Danny was like, don't be afraid. I'm writing something, multiple pages long. I'm gonna send you what I'm writing. I'm gonna send it to your next editor. All the things that are gonna be necessary in order to get it to the final stage. She was like, it's the last thing that I am going to do as editor. And that only further confirmed for me that I'd made the right decision. It was that level of commitment, it was that level of care that I just didn't experience. And so I think when you're thinking about publishing and you're meeting with editors, I think it's folks who get it, folks who care about it, folks who want to see it move forward, that really matters. Because if they don't care, in my opinion, if they're not going to care about it, they're not going to really pay much attention to it. And you want someone to pay attention to your book. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that, absolutely. We had 3 university presses that we approached, not at the same time, but staggered. I guess a few things that I would say to those looking forward to book publishing and reflecting on our experience was, it is a roulette wheel. It is highly unpredictable, and it is about having a champion, having that positive reaction on a personal level from the reader of your book. So Duke just like uniformly rejected it in like one sentence of an email. We're like, oh, okay, all right. But then the other two that we had approached were both really positive, both Chicago and another one which I won't name because it was a really harrowingly terrible experience that I still feel terrible about, where they had offered up a pretty significant advance, a cash advance, and they were promising us a kind of coffee table book that would be quite lavishly produced, and they were looking at a wide audience, color plates. They're actually going to put a fair amount of energy and resources into it, and it's a long story, but I had a personal connection with someone on the editorial board. That's kind of, it was the door opening kind of element of that. But in the end, it just didn't quite feel right for the kind of book that we wanted to produce. And Chicago were equally keen, but in a different kind of way. And it was very particular books in their history that I could think of and point to and like be in the room with the editor and say, I love these books, look at this and this and this, and this, something like that is what we're imagining. They agreed wholeheartedly. And so that was a kind of positive feedback loop with them that led us to ultimately go with Chicago, even though there was no money in it compared to what we were being offered by a different competitor. So we were in a lucky position, I guess, to be able to choose in that regard. But I think the point is that when you write a book, you have to dream into existence. It's what it is. It's an artifact. You've got to imagine it in your hand, right? You've got to think about the experience of reading it. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What's the tone? Like the amplifier, right, on the guitar. You've got to dial up or dial back different characters and flavors of the book you're going to write. And the challenge is to find a publisher and an editor that agrees with that vision, that gets excited by that idea, that can see in their hand what you can see in your hand. That's the challenge. I think it's a mistake, and maybe it's a bit to do with my field, because in geography, you tend not to publish your dissertation as a book straightforwardly. That's not so often done. Often the challenge is, let's say if you are coming out of a PhD, is to think around where's the book in this? Like it might just be a theme in one chapter, or it might be the second half of your PhD thesis, not the first half. It might be some particular spin on it that then makes it a book. And so the challenge is that it's to try and actually foretell what the look and feel of the book is going to be, and then try and approach publishers and find the editor who takes that hook and can share your vision of that. And obviously things like mentoring, getting advice from people who've had experience with particular publishers or know an editor and can make that relationship happen for you, all those things count as well. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Great. Okay, well, I would like to ask a quick question that is maybe an offering and take it up if it works, and if not, it builds on what Maureen was asking about the communities we envision and think we're speaking to when we write, and maybe reframing that a little bit in terms of the kind of gathering function that a book can play, which is to say, sometimes unanticipated communities or communities that you hope will be drawn into formation. I think, Elliott, you kind of wrote to this with like the edges of a discipline as opposed to the core. So I would just love to hear thoughts about that.
I'm happy to. There was an audience I never imagined. I'm just going to tell a very quick story, which one of the people I write about in my book was a Martinican educator who spent his life popularizing, performing spirituals in France, and it's a complicated position he held. But I was interested in, what that revealed. And so his children, who I got to know, invited me to give a talk, a lecture in French in Lyon, where he was from, last year at this, it was like a public gathering. And it was this experience I had never had, right? Because my work is, anyway, that it was like this big audience, a really interesting experience, a lot of people who were part of the choir. And then at the end of it, that became clear was an audience I had never even realized needed to hear that story, which was, the portion of the audience was a Black French audience saying we hear the stories of Lyon, all the time in this particular way, we never hear about this. We never hear about how kind of race and racism got kind of configured into the celebration. And it was really intense for me because I just never thought I would get to have that chance of kind of conjuring, I guess, in a sense, a moment or a community or a moment of recognition. So yeah, that was me.
It's a fantastic comment. And it makes me think about the unsolicited emails and Twitter messages and things that I've had since the book has come out. And none of those individuals know each other or get together, but among them, I can think of guitar industry people who loved the book, who said that very nicely in an email. People whose like aging parents, like members of the public whose aging parents own and love guitars and, you know, loved reading the book and it meant a lot to them personally. People in the timber industry and environmentalists. So like diametrically, people who are across political fault lines have read the book and have said positive things about it. That's really, that I find really interesting. So that a book can be a kind of point of intersection between people who, you know, like might be at loggerheads on so many things, but maybe it's about guitars. Guitars ultimately bring people together and are the source of joy. Maybe it's about that rather than our book, but sometimes, yeah, you can kind of, it's just unpredictable actually when you put a book into the world and what it does in the world. And that's one of the joys and lovely things about writing a book. It's just, you never really quite know what the reaction's going to be and who might read it and who might just email you out of the blue and saying they like it. So, yeah.
Okay, no, I mean, it's just what Chris said. I think that some of the surprising kind of responses have been from, and it should not be surprising, but surprising are like, you know, musicians or art, and not like big name people, right? But like someone like Ravina, who's like a queer South Asian singer, like DM'd me on Twitter and was like, I read your book. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, I remember just being like, what is happening here? What? And she was like, I read it. You know, it's helped me think about this kind of new project that I'm gonna work on. And I was like, it's influenced by Asha Putli and these, but your book is helping me think about the work that I'm doing. And I was like, could have never have imagined that, right? Could have never have imagined that. And that was really powerful. And that's the kind of stuff where I was like, yes, this makes sense, but it is also, I'm just shocked that my book would cross your path. But it does speak to something, really, Deborah, that you mentioned, that I really sort of neglected to mention, was that my book is also open access. And I think that those things do actually also matter, that allowing it to be open, to be widely read, right? Obviously, that's the whole point. But like, that's a kind of sort of implication that I had not anticipated, right? I think I anticipated, I don't know what I wanted. I mean, when Minnesota Press told me it was going to be open access, I was like, thank you, this is amazing. I didn't ask them to do that. They thought they pegged the book to have that, and I was like, well, that's another kind of sign, right? That they felt some way about my book that was good. But I just thought, okay, this is great. Lots of other people are going to read it, but I just thought, I didn't imagine that I would get these social media sort of contacts. Yeah.
Gosh, I appreciate the question. You know, Reverend Tom, my main teacher on the left up here, passed away a year before the book came out. He saw many sections of it, you know, so I mean, in some ways that was an anticipated readership that I cared very much about. You know, but it's really, it's the rising gen of taiko players that I'm most, you know, directed towards. And I could not want their readership more. So it matters to me very much when I learn that some of them have actually read it, and they do, and it doesn't get better than that. Yeah.
Okay. So I just thank you all so much for this wonderful conversation. Chris, Celeste, Elliott, and Deb, please everyone join me in thanking them for sharing so much.